I love challenges. I am an exceptionally goal-oriented individual. So when I start a hobby, I am particularly excited in most cases to figure out what are the reaches of this hobby? What can I learn? What can I do? And exploring what's possible. And I wanted to physically write down and organize my thoughts on what has actually gotten me to where I am in knitting and what do I think will help me continue to grow and get me to where I eventually would like to be. I've been knitting for 16 years, but I believe that statement is somewhat meaningless because someone could knit for 40 years and only ever learn garter stitch. And someone could be knitting for 1 or 2 years and be doing the craziest stuff. AKA Nora Knits is an excellent example of someone that's only been knitting for a couple years and has reached exceptional heights in their technical ability. So I personally still have so much left to learn. And I think if I can continue on this path that I've laid out, that I'll eventually get to where I want to be. However, I should note that I don't think I'll ever be to a point where I'm fully satisfied. That's a whole tangent. Another note is that you do not need to improve. For most of us, this is a hobby. It is meant to be fun. It's meant to be relaxing. It's meant to be enjoyed. And not everybody needs to improve at this craft. For some people, it is enough to just knit the same garter stitch scarf over and over again, and I respect that. Let's get into the list. Cross-train. When someone's training for a marathon, they often will do cross-training. So an example would be they start taking yoga classes because flexibility is important to good running, but running isn't the best way to get more flexible. I think the same principle applies to crafting. For example, for me, sewing has led to me becoming much better at understanding garment construction. How do pieces fit together? When I increase certain measurements in certain places, what does that do to a garment? How can I make something fit my body better? And it takes a long time to do that with knitting because you have to knit up an entire piece to get those results. But sewing tends to be a much faster way of achieving that result. And so it's just helped me learn that skill so much faster than I would have otherwise by just learning it through knitting. There are lessons to be taken from crochet, sewing, embroidery, other fiber arts, any art really. And the more you expand your knowledge in different crafts, the more they lift each other up. As soon as you put more effort into one, the others get a little bit better naturally. And it's certainly not going to make you worse at knitting. Do the same thing twice. If you are trying to learn how to make the perfect chocolate cake, it's a bit silly to only ever make one chocolate cake and be like, well, that just turned out okay. I'll move on to the next item. Like, I'm sure you can make a decent sweater on the first try, but what really helped me take my knitting from good enough to just good is knitting the same thing multiple times. And I know a lot of people have trouble with this. This is probably a good time to mention that you don't need to do all of these things. If you're someone that does want to improve, I would just pick like 1 or 2 of these things. Maybe you're already doing a few of these and applying those. Don't feel pressure to do all of these things because not everyone wants to do this. Some people are very adamant that they do not want to knit the same thing twice. But the way it's been helpful for me knitting the same garment twice is I'm able to analyze what went wrong, trying to use an educated guess to figure out how can I improve it, and then applying that to a new piece and seeing, well, did my theory actually work out? I've started doing this more and more. It was a goal of mine in 2024, and I'm glad Pippin might be hopping up here. Come on, baby, you can do it. She's not a very confident jumper. Also, a clarification, when I say make the same thing twice, there are different ways that this can manifest. You don't just have to make the same exact sweater over and over again. Some ways that I've knit the same thing twice, aside from just knitting an entire new garment, is that I frequently unravel portions of sweaters if I don't like or am not satisfied with how they've turned out. I have completely unraveled certain sweaters. I have a whole video where I unraveled one of my favorite sweaters and reknit it, and I wear that new one so much more than I ever did the previous iteration because there were a couple things that it just didn't fit quite right on the sweater. And I'm so glad that I was able to learn from what didn't work and fix those things in a new sweater without having to buy a whole new bunch of yarn. That could have been $100 of yarn. And obviously, like I said before, you can remake the same thing multiple times without unraveling in the past and just having multiple iterations of the same design. I want to take a moment to recognize that this is not easy for people to do. And I'm speaking emotionally. It can be exceptionally difficult to unravel something that you've put hours into. And what I find helps, and I know other people have found that this helps as well, is just if there's an item and you're like, I know if I just unravel the sleeve and redid it, I would like this so much more. When I know that it's the right thing to do, I will set it aside, And a couple weeks, maybe a couple months, when I'm feeling less raw about it, I will come back, and every time I have a much easier time emotionally unraveling it. Or sometimes I've done this before. I knew that it was the right thing to do. I knew I had to do it. And before I could change my mind and settle, I would just quickly unravel part of it and be like, well, now you have to do it. Knitting is a gift in that way, that it is in general somewhat forgiving to unravel mohair. And it's nice that you can make mistakes and go back and fix them. Expose yourself more to the world of knitting and crochet. When trying to learn a language, so many people will tell you, and rightfully so, that the best way to do it is to do an immersion learning experience. And that could be going to a place where the language is spoken, eating the food, learning about the culture, and really throwing yourself into that world. And absolutely the same thing applies to crafts. I think that the best way to learn without feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm learning, is to put yourself in that universe. For the first 10, 12 years that I knew how to knit, I had no idea there was an online knitting community, and I did not know that there were in-person knitting communities either. I didn't realize that there was community in crafting at all. And I learned very little because I literally did not know that people made their own sweaters. I thought, yeah, sure, some people did that 100 years ago. It's a crazy thing. But it wasn't until a couple years ago where I was like, oh my gosh, no, people legit make their own sweaters. Lots of people make their own sweaters. And all of a sudden it felt way more approachable. And there's so many bits and bobs that I picked up through just being involved in the knitting community that it's just improved my skill and technical knowledge so much more than any other way that I could have learned. And I think an important thing that came from that as well was picking up vocabulary. There are so many new words and terms to use when entering the world of knitting that is so overwhelming and so confusing. And I appreciate that I never had to sit down and look at what do these words mean, because I was able to just pick it up through context of watching enough videos of people talking about it. I didn't know what stockinette stitch was. I knew what a knit and purl stitch was, and I didn't realize that that's what I was doing and what it was called. Another thing that exposing yourself to immersion learning with knitting can do is it can help you feel a lot more connected to the craft. And it almost adds more meaning and community to it, as opposed to just knitting in a vacuum. Learn from different resources. This is a hot take that I think actually a fair amount of people will agree with. You need to learn from multiple sources in multiple ways in order to be the best that you can be. The best engineers that I know are the best because they had a diverse learning experience. So they learned through formal education, in the field training, experimentation, and long-time career experience. It wasn't just one of those things. And I've heard too many people in the engineering field tout these kids don't know what to do because they just studied books. They have no idea how to actually do anything. And then I also heard these guys, they never learned basic calculus and it really shows. Both extremes, I think, are deeply unhelpful, but both are also founded in a kernel of truth. And that's why the best way to learn is not by just picking one route and going with that, but going multiple routes. So there are multiple ways to do this in the world of knitting. So one way is through experimentation. This can be through self-drafting and swatching. I know a lot of people are kind of scared to do this, but did you know that you can swatch without intending to do a project? You can just make a swatch of an idea that you're having, or if you wanted to learn a new stitch technique and you didn't want to invest in making an entire piece using that technique. I've done this before with learning different cabling techniques, so I felt very comfortable with cabling before ever attempting a fully cabled sweater. And the great thing is, if you have a bunch of swatches over time, you can make a cute little bulletin board with all your swatches hung up, or you can stitch them together and make a swatch blanket. Another way to learn is through books. Pattern books, technique books, theory books, stitch Bibles. Shout out moment for local libraries here. You do not need to go and buy a million books. This is my stack of knitting books here, and I've got a lot of them, and I did not need to buy as many as I've bought. You can learn through media, which is what you're doing right now. I think YouTube is such an amazing resource. It's kind of crazy because it's literally like walking into a massive library and not knowing where to start. You can learn through other humans, like going to a knitting club, looking at maybe knitting meetups around you, and hell, you can even go to the nearest retirement home and just see, are there any old women that are willing to offer you their resource of knowledge on crochet in exchange for a free hank of nice yarn. And this whole theory about learning the same thing different ways can also apply to like really technical ideas. So when I learned the Italian bind off, I actually first learned it through Kudavakika's book Knit This, where she has written instructions with images. And I also watched a YouTube video, and I watched another YouTube video, and I found it in another knitting book, and each of them explained it ever so slightly different. And I combined the ones that I liked the most, and now I have a technique for doing it that I absolutely love, totally works for me, and I wouldn't have been able to find that technique without looking at all those different resources. The reason this is so important as well is that it can take you from being a copy and paste knitter to being one that has your own unique style. I see it as copying an outfit off of a mannequin versus styling an outfit from multiple sources of inspiration. Sure, they're both great outfits on paper and they both look great, and other people aren't going to know the difference, but you will. And one is far more personal than the other. And I think because of that, you're going to really appreciate it more than the other. There definitely is such a thing as personal style in knitting technique. How many different sitting positions can I do in the same video? Thank you, Pippin. I really wanted to smell cat poop for the rest of this video. That's absolutely what was missing. Be delusional. Confidence can get you so far. I did not think that I would have to point this out, but I absolutely do after seeing so many comments on different videos of people being like, I could never do that. I am not ready to do that. Oh, that's like way above where I'm at, or I'm scared to try, or I tried a little bit and I immediately wasn't great at it, so I'm giving up. There are so many ways that this manifests for different people. So really be self-critical, or not self-critical, analyze yourself a little bit to see where you do this. Where do you lack confidence and why? Like, it is just nails on a chalkboard when I hear someone say, I can't do that. Like, ma'am, excuse me, not with that attitude. The whole like, oh, I don't think I'm in a place where I could do stranded color work yet. Like, maybe that might be true. You do kind of need to know how to do a knit stitch, a purl stitch, bind off, like cast on. Those are the skills that you need in order to do stranded color work. That's it. And a lot of people are like, well, I don't know how to do stranded color work, so I can't do stranded color work. That's because you haven't tried. For those of you that have not done stranded color work yet, it's literally just doing a knit stitch and picking up a different yarn to do. Like, as soon as you do it, you're like, wow, that's what I was so afraid of. That's really dumb. No one is born knowing how to do fisherman's rib. Why are some people so afraid of trying? I know it's deeply rooted in a fear of failure for some people, and I understand that, but let's try and overcome it a little bit, because there's just no such thing as failure in knitting. It's such a forgiving craft. You can always unravel. The only thing you've lost is your own time, and even so, you've learned something. Oh, great, Pippin. You're just really helping me out today, aren't you? She likes to walk behind the TV and she's too big, so she gets stuck and then she meows for help. Just try. You've got this. Like, maybe my ego is just way too big and I'm far too delusional, but I'm willing to try anything in knitting. And if there's something that I have not tried yet, it's because one, I haven't had time yet and something else has taken priority, like learning a different technique has come first, or because I have no interest in learning that skill. And I think that those are two valid reasons for not learning something. But if you want to, like, what's holding you back? I get so fired up about that. I'm so sorry. Figure out what makes knitting more enjoyable to you. When it can get to the point of being a pure hobby that brings enjoyment, fulfillment, whatever else, getting better at it will naturally follow. And this looks totally different for everybody. For some, it can look like having tons of projects on the needles at once, and for some, not so much. It's the monogamous knitter life for you. Some people like to spend a whole day knitting, and for some, it's just 20 minutes at a time. So instead of trying to think of what do you think you're supposed to like the most, or what do you think you're supposed to be doing, instead just figure out what do you like the most. I have found out that I love knitting marathons. I don't like sitting down to knit for 10 minutes at a time. I like sitting down for like 2 hours to really just lose myself, 2 hours at least, into my project. So yeah, figure out what brings you the most joy and the rest will follow. This is a more technical one that some people may disagree with. Some people may disagree with all of these, and that's fine. Tension and knitting stitches consistently is the hardest and most important part of knitting. This to me is the biggest barrier that weeds people out. When you can get to a point where you can knit a row with consistent stitches, without dropping too many stitches, and without having to think too much about it, and just being able to do knit stitches mindlessly based on muscle memory, that's when you have achieved it. You have made it as a knitter, if you can do that. If you can make a really nice looking rectangle, you can do anything. Literally, in my mind, if you can make a nice rectangle using knit stitches and you don't have to put too much thought into it, you are fully capable of making a Fair Isle stranded colorwork sweater. All those little tiny skills that you need to go from knitting a rectangle to making a Fair Isle sweater, like all those little skills are so tiny in comparison to the mountain that is learning how to do consistent knit stitches. This is where people lose confidence, and I find it devastating. Every time someone gives up before they've reached that point, I die a little bit inside. I just want to scream and shake them and be like, you are almost there. You don't see how close you are. Because before they've gotten to the point where they can make a nice rectangle without having to think too hard about it, if they're climbing a mountain, they think that they've got like 20 miles up ahead and the rest continues to just be uphill forever. And meanwhile, they're actually just like a mile from the peak and the rest is downhill. Like a nice, gentle downhill slope in a field with flowers. Like, yes, it's still effort, it's still walking, but it's definitely not nearly as difficult as going up and reaching that peak. So if you are new in your knitting journey or you haven't even started yet, I would recommend try to get to that point where you can knit a nice rectangle without having to think too hard about it, and it looks nice and consistent. Doesn't need to be perfect, that'll come later. But once you get to that point, then you can do anything. Everything else is so doable. And this is where, in my mind, knitting differs from crochet. This is a hill that I will also die on. So if you disagree with me, you're wrong. In my experience and in my journey, I feel like crochet has a very low barrier to entry as far as difficulty level goes. So when you're first learning how to crochet and you do those like the single crochet and chain and double crochet and triple crochet, that stuff is somewhat easy to learn very quickly. And then when you get a little bit more technical and a little bit more difficult, crochet gets a lot harder. Like I feel like the jump is a lot harder. And then at some point it like stabilizes and you get to a point where you're like, okay, I can pick up other crochet techniques with relative ease at this point. And then I feel like knitting is the total opposite. And this is where people lose it because they assume it's going to be the same as crochet, where they're like, I picked that up in 20 minutes watching one YouTube video and now I know how to crochet. And then they get disappointed when they try knitting and it's so much harder than they thought it was going to be. And then they think it's like crochet where it's just going to keep getting harder. And that's not the case. Knitting starts out, that barrier to entry is so much higher, again, in my opinion. And as soon as you know that foundational skill of cast on, cast off, knit stitch, purl stitch, that's the peak. That's the hardest point, and then everything beyond that is just a steady slope down in difficulty level. And it just becomes so doable. Baby, I gotta see my notes, hun. Be curious. My mentor at work, who just retired and I'm still processing, used to tout this all the time. When something looks wrong, get curious about why. And if you can't figure it out, get help. That's okay. Especially in knitting in the hobby. There are plenty of resources and people to help. And that's where having in-person friends who know how to do this or being a part of an in-person knitting community can really help. Even a virtual community can definitely help with this. When something doesn't fit quite right, try and figure out why and maybe experiment and improve in the future. I noticed when I started following patterns that I was having an issue where my garments would always be much longer in the back and shorter in the front, and my tummy would be exposed while it was like covering my like butt in a weird way. And the fit just wasn't right and I didn't like it. It took about 3 finished garments before I finally figured out what was happening. And it was the short row neck shaping, which some people swear by and need that for things to fit right. But now I do a different type of neck shaping that fits me so much better. And I don't have that issue anymore because I got curious about why is this happening instead of just assuming that something was wrong with me. It did take a couple attempts to figure out what type of neck shaping would help alleviate this issue. So it wasn't something that I figured out immediately. It took a while to figure out what's the problem. And then why is it happening? It took a couple of attempts to answer that question. Take mental notes. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to drive yourself crazy trying to figure everything out, but at least be curious. I've been bringing this up in little ways throughout the video, but put real energy into figuring out what you like, both as an end result and as a process. And this tip, by the way, is not for the pure process knitters. If you are a process purist, like, you can just skip past this one. I think a lot of people get really disheartened when they've knit their first couple of sweaters and they don't fit quite right, or they don't really reach for them as much as their store-bought sweaters, which is totally okay, by the way. But a lot of people, I think, jump to the conclusion of, oh, well, I guess I'm never just going to wear something that I hand knit because I'm never going to make it very good or like exactly the way I want it. Well, figure out what you like. Maybe you don't like making sweaters. Maybe you just like making cardigans. Be the weirdo that goes to a yarn store and touches all the yarn. Figure out what yarn you like and what yarn you don't. Go to a store like Anthropologie or Target or Walmart or whatever and touch all their sweaters. Try a lot of them on, figuring out, what materials do I like? Why do I seem to like that material? What colors do I actually reach for? What constructions seem to fit me the best? Do I like V-necks? Do I like higher up necks? Do I like thick collars, thin collars? A lot of those questions can be answered by just trying them on in a store. Oh, and also like note the gauge when you're looking at stuff, because some people like really tight gauges and some people like really loose gauges. By doing this, I learned pretty quickly that I don't like tight knit bulky synthetic sweaters. Like, it just doesn't fit right. And I kept trying to make them, thinking there's something wrong with me, when I was never really the problem. There's nothing I could have done to make that something I would actually like. And I kept trying to figure it out as if it was a problem I was trying to solve. And it took me a while to accept that I just don't like that. And that's okay. Same with brioche knitting. I absolutely love the way it looks, and I would love to have more brioche pieces in my wardrobe, but I don't like the process of it. So I'm not gonna keep doing it all the time because I just don't love it. So don't assume that you're the problem, and know that it's okay to not like certain aspects of the craft. That's totally fine. And if you can find a way to avoid those things that you don't like, by all means, avoid them. If for you, weaving in ends is so undesirable of a task, so unfun to you that it's ruining the entire craft, then don't feel the need to weave in ends anymore. Just tie them in knots and trim them to be a couple inches long. I give you full permission to do that. And the last tip, I have a whole video talking about, but it is to self-draft. And I get into a lot more details, but in my opinion, self-drafting is the fastest, most efficient and effective way to learn your knitting preferences and to get better at knitting from a technical perspective. It forces intimacy with construction theory in a way that following a pattern just doesn't. And it makes you question why certain things are done, why certain choices are made, why is it the way it is. And that's why it's like one of the best ways to learn, again, in my opinion. Okay, that was a lot, but that is my personal strategy for how I have gone from being a beginner knitter to what I consider being like intermediate advanced. And it's the continued path I will follow to get me to the place of being an expert in this field, in this art, in this craft. I don't know what the right word is for that. If you would like more like technical things that you can do and technical tips, Kuda Vakika has a great video on this. It's called 15 Tips to Be a Better Knitter, and you can check that in the description. I have a link to it if you want like really technical things that you can start implementing right now to make you a better knitter, especially if you're in the more like beginner to intermediate phase of knitting. What's that? You think people should like and subscribe? I think so too. That's a great idea. She's full of great ideas. She's the smart one. I got to go eat some tater tots.